The scream hit the array at 3:17 in the morning. Not a metaphor, a scream. Structured, encoded, compressed into a tight beam transmission that had been traveling for 11 light minutes before it landed in Darius Cole's headphones and made him knock over his coffee. He pulled the headphones off, looked at the waveform on his monitor, put them back on. Still screaming. He was alone in the observatory, had been for 6 hours, the kind of alone that settles into a building at 3 a.m., where the hum of the equipment starts to sound like company, and the parking lot outside is so empty it looks like a photograph of a parking lot. Darius worked the graveyard shift by choice. He was good at quiet. Quiet did not usually scream at him. He ran the signal through the first filter. Not natural, not pulsar noise, not solar wind artifacts, not the usual parade of cosmic radio sources that like to get the team excited before resolving into something boring and explainable. This was structured. He ran the second filter. His hands were steady. He had trained them to be steady through 10 years of sitting in this chair waiting for something that most of his colleagues had quietly stopped believing would come. The second filter returned one word. Artificial. He sat with that for a moment. Then he ran the translation protocol, which was a program the team had built on the assumption that any signal from an intelligent species would follow mathematical logic, would be built from prime numbers or geometric ratios or some universal language of structure. The protocol ran for 4 minutes. It returned nothing mathematical. What it returned were fragments, broken pieces of something that felt less like a message and more like the end of a message, like arriving at a conversation after most of it had already happened. He read them in order. Help us. They are coming. You are the only ones they fear. He read it 3 times. He looked at the empty chair next to his. He looked back at the screen. Buddy, he said quietly to whoever had sent it, you have no idea what you just did. He did not panic. Darius was from Detroit, and Detroit had a way of calibrating a person's sense of emergency. He had grown up watching his grandfather fix things with whatever was on hand, had grown up understanding that a crisis was just a problem that hadn't been addressed yet. He sat in his chair and he worked methodically, the way his grandfather had taught him, running every verification protocol he had, checking the signal's origin point, tracing its trajectory backward through the sky. It came from the L2 Lagrange point, the gravitational parking spot 1,000,000 miles behind the Earth, where solar observation satellites sat in quiet orbit. There was nothing in that orbital zone that should have been broadcasting. He checked the catalog. Nothing human was there. He looked at the coordinates again. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at the signal's frequency, which was outside every band humans had assigned to any satellite, any station, any instrument anywhere. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. His supervisor answered on the 5th ring, voice thick with sleep. Darius, it is 3 in the morning. I know. Whatever it is. I need you to drive in. A pause. How bad? Darius looked at the waveform on his screen. The scream, frozen in visual form, jagged and urgent and very, very old in the way that things traveling at the speed of light are old by the time they arrive. I don't have a scale for this, he said. That's how I know it's real. His supervisor drove in. Then his supervisor called his own supervisor. Then people started arriving, who did not introduce themselves by name. By 6 a.m., the observatory had more personnel in it than Darius had ever seen, and none of them were astronomers. By 8 a.m., he was sitting in a room with no windows. The general who sat across from him was a woman in her late 50s with gray hair cut short, and an expression that had clearly been trained to reveal nothing. She slid a photograph across the table without preamble. It was a still frame, pulled from some kind of external camera feed. The image quality was extraordinary, Whatever had taken it was using optical technology significantly beyond anything Darius had ever seen. The photograph showed open space, stars, and in the middle of the frame, against the clean black of the void, something that made Darius's eyes slide sideways, like they were trying to find a better angle that would make the thing make sense. It did not resolve into sense. It looked at him from the photograph. He put the photograph face down on the table. "So," the general said, "you want the good news or the bad news?" "I'm from Detroit," Darius said. "Give me the bad news first and skip the other part." The general almost smiled. "The bad news," she said, "is that the signal was sent to us specifically. Whatever is out there broadcasting, they know we exist. They have known for some time, and they called us because something is hunting them." She paused. "The good news, which I am going to give you anyway, is that apparently we have a reputation." Darius waited. "They called us," she said, "because they are afraid of what we might do, and whatever is in that photograph is afraid of us too." She tapped the face-down photo. "The question the people above my pay grade are currently screaming at each other is whether that is something we should be proud of or terrified by." Darius thought about his grandfather, about hands rebuilt by 30 years of honest, grinding work, about a man who never once asked whether a problem was solvable before he started solving it. "Both," Darius said. "The answer is both, and then we go anyway." The general looked at him for a long moment. "Get some coffee," she said. "You are going to need it." Outside the room, through a wall he couldn't see through, the signal was still playing on a loop on somebody's monitor. "Help us. They are coming. You are the only ones they fear." 48 hours later, Darius had a security clearance he was not allowed to discuss, a government-issued laptop he was not allowed to connect to any personal network, and the knowledge that somewhere above the earth, parked quietly at the L2 point, a ship that had not been built by human hands was sitting in the dark, broadcasting on a frequency that had not been used since before humans learned to write. He also had a briefing document, 40 pages long, stamped with classification markings in 4 different colors, which explained, in careful, exhausted bureaucratic language, what the Velhari were. He read it in one sitting. Then he sat in the dark for a while and thought about everything it meant. The Velhari had been watching Earth for 600 years, not passively, not the way you watched a nature documentary, actively, cataloging, updating, revising. They had a file on humanity. The file was flagged at the highest possible risk level. Not because humans were violent, not because humans were dangerous in the way that a weapon is dangerous. Because humans were, in the Velhari's accumulated 6 centuries of observation, entirely and specifically unpredictable in their relationship with things that should have destroyed them. The Velhari had a word for it. The briefing document's translator had struggled with it and landed on something approximate. The word translated, roughly, as, "the ones who did not receive the message that some things are impossible." Darius read that line twice. He thought about the photograph, the thing in the void, the way his eyes had slid away from it. He thought about the scream. "Help us. They are coming." He closed the briefing document. He opened it again. He read the section on the Velhari princess, Sci-fi, heir to their governing conclave, the one who had broken 600 years of strict non-contact protocol to send a scream toward a planet that every instinct her civilization had told her to avoid. She had done it because something was hunting her ship, and she had nowhere else to go. And whatever was hunting her was afraid of us. Darius sat in the dark in his government-issued room in a facility whose location he had not been told, and he felt, beneath the exhaustion and the shock and the very genuine fear, something else. Something that felt like his grandfather's hands. Something that felt like, "Tell me what you need and what I get for doing it." He picked up the phone. "I need to talk to the people planning the response," he said. "Mr. Cole, you are an astronomer." "I'm the one who answered the phone," he said. "Put me in the room." A long pause. "Give us an hour." He gave them 40 minutes. The Velhari ship broke atmosphere protocol and sent a shuttle down without asking permission. This caused, briefly, a very significant amount of alarm. The shuttle landed in the Nevada desert at coordinates that Darius would later realize corresponded to the exact center of the empty stretch of land between two classified facilities, which meant the Velhari either had extraordinarily good satellite imaging or a very dry sense of humor. He was starting to suspect the latter. The shuttle sat on the cracked earth for 3 hours and did nothing. Inside the hastily assembled command structure set up half a mile away, generals argued with diplomats, diplomats argued with scientists, and scientists mostly stood near the back of the room looking like they were reconsidering their career choices. Darius stood at the window watching the shuttle. It was smaller than he had expected, silver-white, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, smooth in the way that things designed by genuinely old intelligence are smooth. No visible seams, no visible propulsion, just a shape that sat on the earth with the quiet confidence of something that had been doing this for a very long time. "Why haven't they come out?" someone asked behind him. "They're scared," Darius said. "Of us. Of us." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the usual quiet. The shuttle door opened at hour 4. One figure came down the ramp. Darius had read the briefing. He had seen photographs. He had prepared himself, or thought he had. The Velhari were described as bioluminescent, bipedal, approximately human in general proportion but not in specific detail. Elegant was the word the briefing used repeatedly. Refined. Ancient. The ambassador was all of those things and was also, very clearly, wearing protective gear. It was subtle. You would not have known what it was if you had not read about it. But Darius had read about it, and he recognized the faint shimmer along the suit's surface, the small emitter at the collar that created a localized atmospheric buffer, and above all the particular quality of stillness the ambassador moved with. The stillness of someone who had been briefed on the location they were walking into and was making peace with it. He was wearing the Velhari equivalent of a hazmat suit. To meet humans. On a routine diplomatic approach. Darius walked out to meet him before anyone could stop him, because someone had to go first, and the generals were still arguing about protocol. The ambassador stopped walking when Darius was 10 feet away. His bioluminescence, a soft, shifting blue-green that moved under his skin like light through shallow water, pulsed once and then steadied. His translator bead, a small device worn at the throat, rendered his first official statement to humanity in clear, precise English. "You are smaller than the projections indicated," he said. "This is somewhat reassuring." "We get that a lot," Darius said. The ambassador looked at him. His eyes were large, dark, and patient in the way that very old things are patient. "You are not alarmed," the ambassador observed. "I'm very alarmed," Darius said. "I just don't show it the same way." The ambassador processed this for a moment. "Your species does not show alarm in observable ways." "We show it, you just have to know what you're looking at." "This," the ambassador said, in a tone that suggested he was updating a file somewhere in his mind, "may explain a significant portion of our modeling errors." They walked together toward the command structure. The generals, to their credit, made room. What followed was 6 hours of the most careful conversation Darius had ever been part of. The ambassador's name was something long and tonal that the translator rendered as Vel-Amory, and he answered questions the way a very skilled lawyer answers questions, which is to say precisely, completely, and without ever quite volunteering more than he was asked. But Darius was good at questions. He had spent 10 years asking the universe questions it did not want to answer. He knew how to be patient. He knew how to circle. He knew how to arrive at a thing sideways so it did not have time to prepare. "You have been watching us for 600 years, Darius said. "Observing, yes. And you never made contact." "Contact was not indicated." "Not indicated meaning." "Meaning inadvisable," Velamory said carefully. "Earth carries a classification, a risk tier." "What tier?" A pause. The bioluminescence shifted briefly toward something cooler. "There are 7 tiers in the Velhari observation classification system," Velamory said. 6 are descriptive. 6 describe what a civilization is, its technology level, its communication capacity, its social organization. He paused again. "The 7th tier is not descriptive," he said. "It is prescriptive." "Meaning what?" "Meaning it does not describe what a civilization is. It describes how other civilizations should behave in its presence." Darius waited. "Earth is tier 7, Velamory said. The room was very quiet. "What does tier 7 prescribe?" Darius asked. "Observation only. No contact. No interference. No provocation." Velamory folded his hands, a gesture that seemed deliberate, almost rehearsed, like something he had learned humans did to appear non-threatening. "And under no circumstances, introduction to the wider galactic community until the civilization in question initiates that contact independently." "Why?" Velamory looked at him with those large, patient eyes. "Because you are," he said very carefully, "unprecedented." He explained then, slowly, with the measured precision of someone who had been preparing this explanation for some time and was still not entirely sure how it would land. The Velhari had 43 spacefaring civilizations in their observation catalog. Of those, 31 had followed what the Velhari called the standard developmental arc: technology, communication, expansion, contact, predictable, containable, understandable. 8 had deviated in ways that were unusual but ultimately within modeled parameters. 4 had deviated in ways that were not. Earth was in the 4th category, and it was alone there. Not because of human technology, which was, Velamory said with diplomatic kindness, still developing. Not because of human aggression, which was a common misconception. Many species were aggressive. The Velhari knew how to model aggression. Because of what humans did with things that should have killed them. They domesticated the wolf. Not metaphorically, literally. Took the apex predator of their primary landmass, brought it into their homes, bred it across generations into something that guarded their children. They looked at the horse, an animal fast enough to outrun most of what hunted it, strong enough to break bones with a single kick, and thought about harnessing it to a cart. They looked at the deep ocean, lightless and crushing and full of creatures evolution had spent millions of years turning into efficient predators, and thought about fishing. They had a cultural tradition, replicated independently across 12 separate civilizations on the same landmass, of finding the most dangerous animal in their local environment and attempting to ride it. The word our translation matrix kept returning, Velamory said, was domesticating. You domesticate threats. You do not eliminate them. You do not flee from them. You find a way to make them useful. Silence. "We did not know what to do with this data," he admitted. "It does not fit any of our existing frameworks." Darius looked at the table for a moment. He thought about wolves. He thought about horses. He thought about the ocean, which he had seen exactly twice in his life, and both times felt like standing at the edge of something that had not decided about him yet. "You said the princess called us because the thing hunting her ship is afraid of us," he said. "Yes." "What is it afraid of?" Velamory looked at him for a long time. "That you will do to it," he said quietly, "what you did to the wolf." The room was so quiet Darius could hear the ventilation system. "We would need a ship," he said, "and we would need to talk to the princess. The Conclave has not approved. The Conclave's princess is sitting in a damaged ship at L2 because she already broke their rules to call us," Darius said. "I think we are past what the Conclave has approved." Velamory's bioluminescence shifted. The translation bead did not render it, but Darius had the feeling, looking at that slow, warm pulse of light, that it might have been something like relief. "I will make the call," Velamory said. "What is the predator?" Darius asked. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Velamory set his folded hands on the table. "The Velhari call it the Karath Ven," he said. "It has no fixed form. It has no fixed location. It has consumed 4 civilizations in the past 2,000 years. Consumed is not the accurate word. But it is the closest available. It does not destroy things. It makes them stop being real." He looked at Darius steadily. "We sent 3 diplomatic vessels to observe it 300 years ago. We have not sent anything since." "What happened to the 3 vessels?" "They stopped being vessels," Velamory said simply. Darius nodded slowly. "We are going to need some specific people," he said. The selection process, as Darius understood it, went through approximately 14 different committees before someone sensible put a stop to the committees and handed the file to a woman named Yeva Marchetti. Yeva read the file, looked up once, and said, "I know exactly who we need. None of them are going to want to go. All of them will go anyway." She was right on both counts. Darius met the crew in a briefing room at a facility outside Reno, 2 weeks after first contact, on a morning when the Nevada sky was doing that pale, enormous thing it did in winter where it looked less like sky and more like the ceiling of something very large. He had a folder in front of him. The folder had 4 names in it. He had read all 4 files. He had spent 3 days reading them, actually, because each file was the kind of document that required rereading, the kind that made you pause every few pages and look at a wall for a while. Yeva Marchetti came in first. She was 44, Italian-Ukrainian, built like someone who had survived things by the straightforward method of refusing to be stopped by them. She had spent 3 consecutive winters in Antarctica as chief engineer for a research station, including one winter where the primary heating system had failed in June, and she had kept 6 people alive using a repair manual from 1987, 2 months of improvised engineering, and a vocabulary that one official report described as colorful but effective. She set her coffee on the table, looked at Darius, and said, "You are the one who answered the phone." "Yes." "Good," she said. "I was worried they would send someone who thought this was about glory." "Is it not?" She looked at him over her coffee. "It is about a broken ship and something that eats civilizations and a princess who was brave enough to call the one number she was never supposed to call," she said. "I respect that. Let's not dress it up." Darius liked her immediately. Kwame Asant arrived next. He was 38, Ghanaian, former Special Forces, now technically listed as a security consultant for an agency whose full name was not printed on any public document. He was not large in the way that people sometimes expected soldiers to be large. He was precise. Everything about him was precise. The way he sat, the way he set his bag down, the way he looked at the room when he entered, cataloging it in about 2 seconds with the specific quality of attention that Darius recognized as someone who had spent years in places where inattention had consequences. He said nothing for the first 10 minutes of the briefing, just listened. Velamory, who had been brought in to provide context and was sitting to Darius's left, kept adjusting his position in his chair. Darius noticed it on the second adjustment. He looked at Velamory. Velamory's bioluminescence was doing something subtle and cool around the edges. He was trying to put distance between himself and Kwame, without knowing why he was doing it. Which meant that something in the Velhari's deep, old, pattern-recognizing intelligence, was picking up something about Quame that it did not have a category for, and was defaulting to the universal response to uncategorized things. Space. Darius made a note. Dr. Priya Anand arrived 4 minutes late, which she acknowledged with a single raised hand and the expression of someone who was late because she had been thinking about something important and time had been an unfortunate casualty of that process. She was 35, a xenobiologist from the University of Edinburgh by way of Mumbai, and she had spent her career studying extremophiles, organisms that existed in conditions that should have made life impossible: boiling ocean vents, Antarctic ice, the acid lakes of Yellowstone, things that had, by any reasonable biological standard, not received the news that they should not be alive. Her published thesis, which she had defended against 4 rounds of peer rejection and one very memorable departmental committee meeting that she described as clarifying, was titled, "Life Does Not Avoid Hostile Environments, It Colonizes Them." She sat down, opened her laptop and said, without looking up, "Someone in this room is going to ask me whether studying things that live in impossible places qualifies me for this mission, and the answer is yes, for reasons I will explain once everyone has arrived." The last person through the door was Roz Park. 26 years old, naval engineering, stationed most recently on a submarine based out of Busan, grew up on the water, specifically the Korea Strait, in a fishing family that had worked the same stretch of sea for 4 generations. She was small and quiet, and had the kind of stillness that you sometimes saw in people who were very comfortable in confined spaces in the dark. Darius had read her psychological profile 3 times because it was unusual, not in a concerning way, in an interesting way. The profile noted that Roz's neurological responses to threat stimuli were atypically measured. Where most people showed sharp spikes of stress response, she showed something more gradual, more like the response pattern of someone adjusting to a new environment than someone reacting to a danger. The psychologist who wrote the profile had flagged it as a possible desensitization artifact from years of submarine service. Darius suspected it was just Roz. She sat down, looked at the photograph of the HFY that was up on the screen at the front of the room, studied it for about 15 seconds and said, "Is that the thing we're dealing with?" "Yes," Darius said. She nodded once. "Okay," she said, and opened her notebook. The briefing proper began. Velamory laid out what the Velhari knew about the HFY with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that he was the only person in the room who had access to 2,000 years of documented encounters and wanted to make sure the information transferred cleanly. He described its behavior, its range, the 4 civilizations, the 3 observation vessels that had gone to study it 3 centuries ago and stopped being vessels. He described, as best he could, what it actually was. A distributed intelligence, too large and strange to assign conventional coordinates to. No fixed biology, no fixed form. It operated by something Velamory called unmaking, a word he used because the Velhari translation for the actual mechanism was a 17-syllable term that the translator Bede rendered as the cancellation of the structural belief that a thing exists. "It doesn't destroy things physically," Priya said, not looking up from her notes. "No," Velamory confirmed. "It introduces doubt into the informational structure of things. The thing stops believing it is real and then stops being real." Very long pause. "Yes," Velamory said. He sounded faintly unsettled, in the way people sometimes sound when someone has gotten to the answer before the question was finished. "That is a more precise description than any I have provided." "It's a consensus predator," Priya said. She looked up. "It can only unmake things that accept the premise of being unmade." The room was quiet. "So the defense," Roz said from her corner of the table, "is just not accepting the premise." "Theoretically." "That's simple," Roz said. "It is," Priya said. Except for the part where you have to mean it, not intellectually, not in a "I understand the mechanism so I am not afraid" way. You have to mean it at whatever level the HFY is reading, which is deeper than thought. "What level is that?" Darius asked. Priya looked at him. "Instinct," she said. "The part of you that has been surviving longer than language has been around. The part that got your species through ice ages and predators and famines, and all the things that should have ended the story early." She closed her laptop. "The HFY has consumed 4 civilizations because 4 civilizations, when confronted with something that questions the reality of their existence, agreed to the question. They were sophisticated enough to understand it. And understanding, it made them vulnerable to it." She looked around the table. "We," she said, "are being sent because our species has a specific, documented, historically consistent relationship with things that should end us. We have never once agreed that they get to." Silence. "That's the whole plan," Yeva said. "That's the core of the plan," Priya said. "There are engineering components. Roz has a resonance pulse idea that I think has about a 40% probability of working." "That's almost half," Quaim said. It was the first thing he had said in 2 hours. "I know," Roz said. Yeva looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at each of them in turn, this collection of specific and deliberately chosen people. This crew assembled not for their heroism or their aggression, but for their particular, almost unreasonable relationship with the concept of impossible. "When do we go?" she asked. Darius looked at Velamory. Velamory's bioluminescence pulsed once, warm and quick, and the translation bead did not render it. But Darius, who had spent 2 weeks learning to read Velhari light the way you learn to read weather, thought it meant something close to, finally. "The princess is waiting," Velamory said. The Velhari ship was nothing like what Darius had expected, and exactly what the briefing documents had described, which meant the briefing documents had done a poor job. It was large in the way that old buildings are large, not just in dimension but in weight, in the sense that it had been standing somewhere for a long time, and had accumulated the quiet confidence of a thing that had not needed to prove itself for several centuries. The interior was lit with the same bioluminescent technology that lit the Velhari themselves, soft and shifting and present in the way that natural light is present, the way sunlight through leaves is present. Nothing harsh. Nothing that announced itself. The crew had been aboard for 8 hours when the princess asked to see Darius alone. Velamory had offered to come. Darius had said no, politely and firmly, in the way that he said most things, and Velamory had accepted it with the expression of someone who had been expecting it, and was choosing to be glad rather than offended. Sahivel was in the forward observation room, a space that was almost entirely transparent on 3 sides, looking out at the stars the way you look out at something when you have been looking at it for a long time and have stopped seeing it, and are really looking at something else entirely. She was smaller than the photograph suggested. Her bioluminescence was running slow and dim, close to what Darius was learning to read as exhaustion, and something underneath it that the translation documents called ashamed. He sat across from her. He did not say anything at first. He had learned in the past 2 weeks that Velhari communication operated differently at the beginning of difficult conversations. You arrived. You were present. You let the person with the harder thing to say choose the entry point. She spoke in her own language, and the translation bead at her collar rendered it into English with the slight delay that Darius was getting used to. "My council did not approve the signal," she said. "I know. They would have evacuated, filed a formal emergency petition with the conclave, followed protocol." She was quiet for a moment. "Protocol has a documented failure rate against the HFY of 100%. I know that too. I calculated that the probability of a successful outcome via protocol was effectively 0, she said, and I had been briefed on the Tier 7 classification, on your species." She looked at him directly. The light under her skin was very still. I made a decision without authorization because I believed it was the correct decision, and I am prepared to accept whatever my council decides about that. But I needed to tell you that I would make it again." Darius looked at her for a moment. "My grandfather used to say," he said slowly, "that the right choice and the permitted choice are not always the same thing, and that a person finds out a lot about themselves in the moment they have to pick between them." She was quiet. "What kind of person does this make me?" she asked. "The kind that's still here," he said. "The kind whose ship still exists. That's a decent answer." The Carathven arrived 6 hours later. There was no warning, no sensor reading, no proximity alarm, no gradual approach that would have given them time to prepare. The navigation array simply stopped functioning. Not an error, not a failure. The readings disappeared, one by one, with the calm finality of lights being switched off in a building everyone has left. Yeva looked at the readouts. She said. Roz was already at her engineering station, pulling up the resonance pulse schematics she had been refining for 3 days. Her movements were steady and methodical. She did not look like someone whose ship was being approached by something that had ended 4 civilizations. She looked like someone doing familiar work under mild time pressure. Quaim moved to the observation post without being asked, and stood there looking at the space where the navigation readings had been, with an expression of complete and undivided focus. Priya pulled up her scanner array and started running readings. Darius sat down at the communication console and looked at the blank screen. The blankness spread. Not visually, the stars were still there, the physical world was intact, but informationally. The ship systems began dropping readings in a spreading pattern that felt, disturbingly, like a thought being forgotten, like waking up mid-sentence and losing the end of it. "It is reading the ship," Vel Amory said from the doorway. His light was running cold and rapid. "It is introducing the possibility that the ship systems are not certain of their own function." "And if the systems accept that possibility," Darius asked, "they will stop functioning, not because they are broken, because they will no longer be certain they should be working." Priya looked up from her scanner. "It is talking," she said. "In what sense?" "In the sense that it is communicating, not in language, in pressure." She adjusted her scanner. "It is telling the ship systems that their existence is temporary and uncertain, and it is waiting for them to agree." "Does it know we're here?" Darius asked. "Does it know it's talking to something that can talk back?" Priya ran her scanner across the spreading blankness. "It is about to," she said. Darius pulled up the communication console and stared at the input field for a moment. Then he started typing. He typed in plain English, because the communication array had a translation function, and because plain English was, in his experience, the most direct way to say exactly what you meant with the least decoration. He typed hello. The pressure in the room changed, not physically, informationally. Something vast and old and outside the usual categories of large and old turned its attention in their direction with the slow rotation of something that had not needed to pay attention to a new thing in a very long time. The console returned text, not from any human input, text that materialized in the input field the way meaning materializes in a mind, not typed, arrived. "You are small," it said. "You are temporary, you know this." Darius read it. He thought about everything, about his grandfather's hands, about wolves that became dogs, about some person standing next to some animal that should have destroyed them, deciding instead to try something different, about 4 civilizations that had looked at this thing and agreed to the premise. He typed, "Yeah, so." The pressure increased. It was not threatening exactly. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a very high place, the gravitational honesty of a drop that does not care about you personally, just the fact of it. "You will be unmade," it returned, "as all things are." Darius typed, "Sure, eventually, but not today, and not by you." Something shifted, something vast and old recalibrated. He typed, "I have had worse weeks. I have known worse things than you. They did not end me." Silence from the console. The informational blankness held but did not spread. He typed, "You are looking for something that doubts itself. We are not that. We have never been that. Look at our history. Look at what we did with wolves. Look at what we did with the ocean. Look at what we did with everything that should have destroyed us." He paused, then typed, "We made it useful." Roz said quietly from across the room, "I have the pulse ready." Darius did not look up. He typed, "You have eaten 4 civilizations because 4 civilizations agreed to the question you were asking. We are not going to agree. Not because we do not understand the question. We understand it fine. We have always understood it. We have looked at our own smallness and our own temporary existence, and we metabolized it a long time ago. It is not a weapon you can use on us. It is just a fact we already know." He typed, "We are still here. That is our entire answer. We are still here." The pressure held for one long moment. Then it changed. Not gone, not defeated. Something more like the moment when a very large animal encounters something it does not recognize and stops. Not afraid, because the categories of afraid and not afraid are too simple for what was happening. Something more like uncertainty encountering itself for the first time. "It has paused," Priya said, her voice careful and controlled. "It is recalibrating. It has never encountered a consensus that would not break." Roz said, "Running the pulse now." The ship shuddered once. A deep, bone-level vibration that moved through the hull and through the floor and through everyone standing on it. The engineering term for what Roz had built was a gravitational resonance disruption, which was a precise and technical way of saying that she had found the frequency at which the Karath-Ven's distributed structure was most coherent and introduced a competing frequency designed to create interference. Like holding a tuning fork next to another tuning fork. Like teaching something what noise felt like from the inside. The console went dark. The stars outside the observation window were still there. The navigation array came back online. One reading at a time, then faster, then all at once, like a room full of lights being switched back on, the ship's systems returned. The informational blankness receded. The ship remembered itself. Quame exhaled once slowly and came away from the observation post. Yeva looked at her readouts and said, in a tone that was different from the earlier one. The same word doing entirely different work. Priya was running scans, her fingers moving quickly across her console, and after 2 minutes she said, "It is withdrawing, not fleeing. Withdrawing is different. It is recategorizing the encounter." "What does it recategorize us as?" Darius asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Unknown," she said. "It has moved us to a category it has never used before, a category it apparently just created." She looked at him. The category label translates roughly as things that do not agree. Velamory, from the doorway, said something in Velhari that the translation bead did not render. He said it quietly, to himself, and his bioluminescence had shifted into something warm and fast and golden bright, the first time Darius had seen it do that. He asked later what Velamory had said. Velamory was quiet for a moment. "There is no accurate translation," he said finally. "The closest I can offer is, I should have called sooner." The formal Velhari response arrived 48 hours after the Karath-Ven withdrew. It was, by Velhari diplomatic standards, extremely fast. Normally, a conclave response to a first contact situation took months of committee discussion, formal review, subcommittee review, 3 rounds of linguistic verification, and a final ceremonial reading before a panel of 11 senior delegates. This one took 48 hours. It was also, by anyone's standards, extremely long. 17 pages in the Velhari original, 31 in the translated version, covering legal frameworks and diplomatic protocols and philosophical considerations and historical precedent, and a section near the end that Darius read 3 times, because it seemed to be a formal apology for 600 years of classification without disclosure, though it was worded with enough diplomatic layering that he could not be entirely sure. He read all 31 pages on the shuttle back from the Velhari ship, sitting by himself in the small observation port with the Earth growing slowly larger in the window. That impossible blue, that unreasonable beauty that no amount of familiarity seemed to dull. The summary of the 17 pages could have been shorter. He knew what it said beneath the formal language. He had heard it in Velhamari's voice in the doorway of the observation room. He had seen it in the way the Velhari crew had moved differently through the ship after the withdrawal, with less of the careful, practiced stillness of people managing their own fear, and more of the ordinary purposeful movement of people who had remembered why they were doing their jobs. The conclave was grateful. The conclave was deeply concerned. The conclave had many questions, the most pressing and least answerable of which was, essentially, why? Why had the crew gone? What had Earth gained? What was the logic of the exchange? Darius had drafted 3 responses to this question, and deleted all 3 because they kept coming out sounding like philosophy when they were actually much simpler than that. He wrote the final response himself, without committee input, on a notepad with a pen, the way his grandfather had written things he wanted to mean. He wrote because she asked us. He read it back. He wrote it into the official diplomatic channel. 4 words, sent to a 37-delegate conclave that had been cataloging civilizations for 6,000 years. Because she asked us. He did not explain it. Velhamari had once told him that the Velhari found unexplained statements from humans disconcerting, because they implied that the explanation existed, but the human had decided it was obvious enough not to state. This created, Velhamari said, the unsettling impression that humans were operating from assumptions so fundamental to their character that they could not conceive of needing to articulate them. Darius had said, "That's exactly right," and watched Velhamari's light do something complicated. The shuttle landed in Nevada at 6 a.m. on a Thursday, and the drive back to the facility took 2 hours, and Darius spent most of it watching the desert go by from the back window of a car driven by a government employee who did not speak. The desert in winter was a particular kind of beautiful, pale and stripped down, nothing decorative, just what it was. He thought about the crew. Yeva was already back in engineering briefings, he had been told. She had apparently spent the first hour after the shuttle landing delivering a comprehensive verbal report to a room full of military engineers, the content of which was being described in memos as extremely detailed and occasionally unprintable, and one of the most useful operational assessments we have received in this process. She was scheduled to return to Antarctica in 6 weeks. He suspected she would delay it. Quaim had disappeared, politely, professionally, completely. This was, Darius had come to understand, how Quaim returned to his regular existence. He stepped out of one context and into another with the clean transition of someone who had done it many times and knew how to close the door behind him. Darius suspected they would see him again, in some capacity, when the time came. Priya had taken a temporary research position with a joint Velhari human scientific working group that had been formed, somewhat chaotically, in the 2 days after the withdrawal. She had sent Darius a message that contained exactly 1 sentence of personal content. "This is the most interesting thing that has ever happened," and 4 paragraphs of preliminary findings about the Karathven sensory mechanisms and what Priya was calling the informational consensus biology of distributed intelligence. Roz had sent him a single message from Busan. "Arrived home, see looks good, let me know when the next one is." He had saved all of them. The message he had saved first and read the most times was from Sehivel. It had arrived 3 days after they had parted on the Velhari ship, Tight beam, direct channel, encoded for his personal clearance. He had opened it expecting Velhari formal language, the ornate diplomatic phrasing he was learning to navigate, and instead found something that had clearly been composed very carefully in English. Imperfect English, in the best possible way. English that showed the effort of someone who had learned it as an act of deliberate choice, who had wanted the thing they were saying to arrive in his language, because his language was the right language for this particular thing. He read it every few days, not because he had forgotten it, but because he liked the act of reading it. It said, "The Karathven has been entered into the Galactic Threat Archive with a new notation. The notation covers its encounter with your species and the outcome of that encounter. The designation field for the encounter type was blank for 11 days because no existing category in the Velhari classification system applied to what your crew did. The Conclave's Threat Assessment Division created a new category. It is a short category, single entry, currently. The description field reads, contact initiated, outcome, entity recategorized, method, refusal to participate in the entity's primary cognitive mechanism. The category name, which will be used in all future archival reference to this encounter, translates from Velhari as Introduction of the Concept of No. My council has reviewed my decision to break protocol and send the signal. I appeared before them for 4 hours. They asked me many questions. At the end they said that while my actions were in technical violation of established contact procedure, the outcome justified a review of the procedure rather than a sanction against me. I told them the outcome was not what I had calculated. I had calculated that you would help because you were dangerous. I did not calculate that you would help because I asked. I have been thinking about the difference between those two things for many days. I do not have the right word for what the difference is. Perhaps your language does. Perhaps it is in one of the words that your translation matrix cannot render for us, the ones that your languages carry that ours do not, the ones we keep flagging as untranslatable and setting aside and returning to because we cannot stop wondering what they contain. I will keep learning. Sci-fi. He folded the printout and put it in his jacket pocket. The car pulled into the facility. He went through security. He found his temporary office, which had a window now, somebody having decided that the no windows protocol was no longer necessary for a man who had recently been on a Velhari warship. He sat down. On his desk was a new briefing document, 3 inches thick, stamped with the new classification codes that the joint working group had developed over the past week. Above it, on a sticky note in someone's handwriting, was, "They want you to lead the permanent liaison office. Take your time deciding." He set the sticky note aside. He looked out the window at the Nevada sky, which was doing the pale, enormous winter thing again, that sky that looked like the ceiling of something very large. He thought about his grandfather, about hands that had been rebuilt by honest work, about a man who had stood on a factory floor for 30 years and never once asked whether what he was doing was possible, only whether it needed doing. About the thing his grandfather used to say when people described something as impossible, that particular look he would get, patient and slightly amused, the look of a man who had heard the word used incorrectly so many times it had started to sound funny. About wolves that became dogs. About horses that pulled carts. About the deep ocean full of things evolution had spent millions of years building into absolute predators, and the humans who had looked at all that dark and pressure and biological nightmare and thought, fishery. About a species that had metabolized its own smallness so long ago, so thoroughly, so completely, that it did not even register as a fact worth mentioning anymore. That had taken the knowledge of its own impermanence and made it into fuel. That had looked at everything in its history that should have been the end of the story and found, somewhere in itself, the specific and unreasonable refusal to agree. Not courage, not aggression, not heroism, which was a word that dressed things up in ways they did not need to be dressed. Just that one simple thing. We are still here. That is our answer. That has always been our answer. We are still here. The galaxy had categories for dangerous things, categories for advanced things, categories for things worth watching, things worth avoiding, things worth classifying and filing and reviewing every 50 years at a standing committee. It had not had a category for this. Now it did. Single entry, currently. He picked up the sticky note. He read it again. He set it down. He opened the briefing document. Outside, the Nevada sky was enormous and pale, and doing that impossible thing it did, where it looked less like sky and more like the beginning of something. He went to work. The galaxy had monsters. They introduced them to ours. Ours do not have claws. Ours do not have weapons that end stars or intelligence that span centuries or forms that the eye cannot follow. Ours just look at every impossible thing and say, not today. And then they show up. And then they do not leave. That is the whole story. That has always been the whole story. We are the ones who showed up. We are the ones who do not leave. That is what the galaxy is learning to put in the file. That is what the Velhari will tell their children, in the soft bioluminescent dark of their long, elegant, ancient civilization, when the children ask about the strange small species on the blue planet that the Tier 7 classification had warned them about. The ones they were afraid of. The ones who turned out to be afraid of everything too. The ones who did it anyway. The ones who answered when called. The ones who looked at a monster and did not ask, can this be survived? The ones who asked, what do we need and what do we get for doing it? And then went. Darius Cole sat in his office in Nevada with a window and a 3-inch briefing document and a sticky note that was probably going to change the rest of his life. And he read the first page, and then the second, and somewhere outside the door someone was making coffee that smelled like the observatory, like 3 a.m., like the particular quiet of a night when the universe decides to make a noise you were not expecting. He turned to page 3. He was still here. As always. As ever. As they were.